Well, thank you all for being here. It's a great crowd this morning, and we have a really exciting program for you. My name is Jack Gillis, and I'm here on behalf of J.P. Morgan to welcome you to the 7th annual Seeds of Change event at the Danforth Plant Science Center. Welcome, everyone. Excuse me, this is always an engaging and thought-provoking event, and it provides an opportunity to hear from some of the leaders about many of the issues that are so central to the mission of the Danforth Plant Science Center. So this morning is no different from that. We're going to focus on the community, even really the ecosystem. You're going to hear that word a lot today. The ecosystem in which we all live and work, and how that ecosystem is helping, and maybe ways that it could be helping more to generate startup activity, to help new businesses get going and get started and grow and thrive in our hometown here in St. Louis. First, we're going to hear from our guest speaker, David Karandish, and then David will be joined by a panel of other leaders in the community. We're going to have a lively discussion and get you all out of here as close to 9 as we can. Now I have the honor of introducing you to this year's Seeds of Change speaker, David Karandish. David is the former CEO of Answers Corp., where he was responsible for setting corporate strategy and driving revenue partnerships. Prior to joining Answers, David was the CEO of Expo Group, an online resource in the consumer mortgage industry, and also served as a consultant at Monster Commerce, where he built the paid advertising management system. As you'll hear today, and you'll hear more about, David has been involved in a lot of other startups and really intimately involved in the local ecosystem. He earned his BS in computer science right here in St. Louis at Washington University, studying computer science as well as entrepreneurship, and graduating in 2005 cum laude, and is a member presently of Lewis and Clark chapter of the Young Presidents Association, the Young Presidents Organization. So please join me in welcoming David to the stage. David, thank you.
Thank you. How's everyone doing this morning? Excellent, excellent. So this morning I'm actually going to start out a little atypical. I'm going to start out with a correction from last night. Anyone who was here at the reception last night, raise your hand. So people asked about my family, and I said I have 3 girls at home under 5, and then we have 4 in the oven. That is number 4 in the oven, not quadruplets in the oven. Otherwise, I would be here at the Danforth Center, but I'd be asking them to research sleep aids. So, all right, so with that said, I thought we would get started here. We're going to kick off with a little 2,000-year-old proverb or parable. The parable of the seed. So one day there was a seed. This is a very anatomically correct, perfectly drawn seed here. Perfect way to lose your audience is by drawing an item that plant scientists look at every day with a iPad Pro stylus. So, okay, so we have our seed here, and the seed fell among the rocky ground. And unfortunately, when the sun came out, the sun scorched that seed, and the seed was no longer able to grow. Now, there was some other seed, and this seed fared a little better. It landed on the path, and the only issue there was that there were these birds that came by. And these that actually took me a lot of work to be able to make PowerPoint do that. Okay, I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you. I'm very proud of myself. But the birds came by and they took that seed, and that seed was not able to, get its roots. There was another seed that actually started to grow, and it was doing pretty well. But then the thorns came in and kind of choked the life out of it. Now, lastly, there was a seed that started to grow. And it grew, and it grew, until you had this bountiful harvest. Now, this parable was 2,000 years ago, a little Christian parable about kingdom of God, but I think the same thing applies to the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in St. Louis. And so today what I'm going to talk about is how do we fertilize the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in St. Louis? How do we get entrepreneurs here? How do we keep them here? What are we doing well? What can we improve? So first with my bullseye, why don't we start out with what we're doing well. When I started what was originally called Find Stuff and eventually became Answers Corporation back in 2006, we had a very difficult time getting capital. The early stage capital formation portion of St. Louis was difficult. There was lots of old money. There were lots of folks who could invest in categories like manufacturing, but to go do a startup website, it was tough. Well, today, we've got groups like Cultivation Capital, Capital Innovators, Arch Grants, Lewis and Clark, who are putting capital to work in young entrepreneurs' hands. We've made a lot of progress there. I would give us a much stronger grade in that area than some of the others. Another thing is that we're getting corporate sponsors. This is my representation of corporate America. We're getting great corporate sponsors. And so, obviously here, Monsanto. You've seen AB sponsor just about every event where beer can be drunk. And you also see folks like Boeing opening up their patent portfolio and saying, hey, we're going to go turn these into businesses. Let's go take some entrepreneurial kids and see if we can turn this into the next venture. And so the early stage capital, I think we're doing pretty well. The corporate sponsorships, I think we're doing pretty well. But the question is, what can we improve? What can we do to make fertile ground for entrepreneurship here in St. Louis? And so I've identified 5 areas that we'll walk through today. The first one, teaching kids to create and teaching kids to code. If you think about the world that we live in, one of the fastest ways to build a business is to build something in digital, something where you can reach millions of consumers online without having to have a physical storefront, without having to have a physical product. Now, I don't think that every kid is going to become the next Bill Gates, but I do think that there's some improvements that we can make. So I don't know how many of you guys know this, but in the state of Missouri, we get about 2.5 school years of education for earth science. Now, I'm a big fan of stalactites and stalagmites, as you can see here in my very accurately drawn drawing here, right? And it's good, and I'm pro earth science. I'm a big fan of earth science. But to me, teaching computer science should be just as big of a priority, maybe even a higher priority than teaching earth science to today's kids. And so from a public policy standpoint, for those of you who are connected politically on either side of the crazy aisles that we have in our political system, continuing to push for teaching programming to our kids, I think is a really important endeavor for us. I also think it's important from the standpoint of some of the biggest challenges we have that are unique to our city. So when you have kids who say, oh, I want to go build a web page, a lot of times, you think about the kid that you're thinking of when you go through that exercise. Those kids live on both sides of Del Mar. If you want to help heal this city of the racial divide that we have, we need to be teaching kids on both sides of Del Mar how to code and showing them a way out that you won't have selling drugs or playing basketball. And so to me, teaching kids to code is one of the first things that I want to do to help really improve the St. Louis entrepreneurial ecosystem. The second thing is, when you think about the idea of bringing a product to market, it's really important that we teach product design as a discipline and not as an afterthought. The number of times I have a smart MBA student come to me from WashU or from SLU and say, hey, I've got this great idea, and I even think I can get the capital behind it, but I don't know how to go build the product. People would come to me and say, David, do you have a hard time finding engineers in St. Louis? And I'm like, yeah, it's hard to find good developers. But if you can get someone who knows how to build products, those are the hardest roles to fill, at least in the technology sector that I come from. So I don't care if you're learning to build something in transportation or something in the furniture or physical goods space. I don't care if you're talking hardware, if you're talking entertainment, or you're talking software and apps. Our universities, our workshops, our ecosystem, we need to say for St. Louis, we're going to be a city of product creators. We're going to be a city of makers, not a city of managers. The third thing that I want to talk about here today is what we get to do to import entrepreneurs into this city. That also took a sad amount of work to get the truck going. And in an earlier version, the wheels were spinning and he had some rims, but that didn't make the final cut. So every year we have these freshman classes that come in from the coast, from New York, from Boston, from San Francisco, from LA, and they go to our fine universities. And it's almost like bringing in a truckload of new seeds into the city. in order to bring new entrepreneurial both vision and vigor into our city. And at the same time, when we have these graduating seniors, a lot of times we end up sending these folks back out. They go back out to the coast and they leave St. Louis. And so to me, one of the first things we need to do is we need to track how many entrepreneurial-minded students we have in this city. Where are they? What are they interested in? And we need to make sure that we are a net importer of entrepreneurs rather than a net exporter. On the college campus side, that means that entrepreneurship should move from being kind of I'm not sure if that's really a major, to a very highly coveted major. And then on the overall entrepreneurial ecosystem, we should set up incentives, whether financial or otherwise, for entrepreneurs to reload here. Now, on the college side, how do you get a college student to stay in St. Louis? How do you get an entrepreneurial person to stay in St. Louis and prove that kind of thesis out? That leads me to point number 4. And so point number 4 is the internship program. At our zenith, I think Answers had about 45 interns from WashU interning at our Del Mar location. And so when you're an intern, you take on superpowers. And I mean that in all seriousness. The superpower of being able to sit down with the founder, a superpower of being able to learn a business model when you're in your teens rather than when you're in your 30s or 40s. A superpower of being able to do real, meaningful work as opposed to kind of grunt work or things that are not going to move the ball forward. And so everyone in this room, who in this room is a parent? Parent or grandparent, right? Okay, that's almost everyone here. A lot of seeds have been planted by the people in this room. I would highly encourage you to tell your sons, tell your daughters to intern at an entrepreneurial company, intern at a startup. Now, they might not all go on to build a startup. They might not all go on to work at a startup. But studies have shown that as kids get more access to spending time at startups, they're actually more likely to stay here in St. Louis. And so you want to keep that talent here in St. Louis, have your kids go intern at a great startup. And lastly, I want to talk about the different types of seeds. So for us, when we started what was originally Find Stuff, then Announced Media, and then Answers.com, we were a bit of an anomaly. We didn't look like a lot of the other seeds here in St. Louis. St. Louis has a lot of great biotech companies. It's got a lot of great med tech companies. But there weren't a ton of consumer-facing internet websites at the time that we started. We need to do more and more to encourage what I'll call St. Louis atypical companies to be here. So a couple examples. I look at some of the startup activity that's happening around the artificial intelligence space. I look at also things like areas of Silicon Valley where you can go and get a drone delivery taco copter, right? There are whole companies that are starting out delivering food via drone. Now, there is literally no technical reason why that couldn't happen here. In fact, if it were up to me, I would actually get an AI to put my order in and have the drone delivery deliver my guacamole. So as we look at other startups in the region, we need to be able to say, look, what else are we missing? What new areas, what new technologies should we be investing in, should we be encouraging, so that we're not a two-seed town? So what I thought I'd do is walk a little bit through my own life on how these things intersect. So one of the early seeds that was planted for me was I got my first computer in high school. It was literally being thrown away. My dad worked for a battery testing company called Bytrode, and they took all their old computers and they were sitting next to the trash. And he's like, oh, I should take one of these home for my son. From there, I started to learn how to program. And after many hours, I was starting to build stuff. I met my business partner, Chris, in high school, and we started working together by entering into a business plan competition that was held by UMSL. So we submitted a business plan for a 3D internet product, and it was totally ridiculous. And we were in the top 3 of the finalists out of 4 finalists. But in all seriousness, we got $1,500 out of that competition, and that was the seed capital that we used to go start a little venture that we called AIM Talk, which was text-to-speech plugin for the AOL Instant Messenger. So back before Facebook, back before texting, all of my friends and I would communicate via AOL. From there, we went off to Washington University and interned at a company called Monster Commerce. Now, Monster Commerce developed out a software as a service platform for helping small businesses sell their products online. From there, we learned how to market things on the internet, and we started a little financial services company called Expo Group, and that gave us a little bit of notoriety, a little bit of cash in our pockets, and helped land me on a little TV show called The Apprentice. I was on the Martha Stewart Apprentice, so there were about 5 people who watched that season, so I didn't get to meet our future president. Oh, God. Oh, I weep for that statement. Okay, so then we met Tom Hillman, who's here today, is one of the guest lecturers in one of the entrepreneurship classes at WashU. And it happened that Yahoo was a sponsor of The Apprentice that season. And so when we wanted to go start our comparison shopping engine that became Announced Media, we were able to get capital and resources and mentorship from Tom. We were able to use some of the resources that we had developed from the Expo Group. And then we got Yahoo to be our first big business partner. From Announced Media, we pivoted a couple times, and we ended up buying a company called Answers.com and moving its headquarters here to St. Louis. And then eventually, we did a roll-up of a software as a service platform of a company called 4C and a couple of other different software companies underneath that. At the same time, the folks from Monster Commerce started a company called OneSpace that does some crowdsourcing SaaS platform for the on-demand economy. I'm a small investor and an advisor there. We spun off Gateway Media as another company out of Answers after we did the Apex transaction in 2014. And then Tom went and started the Lewis and Clark investment group. And so Lewis and Clark then invested in OneSpace. Chris and I took some of the capital from Answers, and we invested in a company called Varsity Tutors, which is now doing a lot in the online tutoring area and one of the fastest growing tech companies in St. Louis. And then lastly, back from my coding days, I'm involved as an advisor with a group called Loop that's trying to teach kids on both sides of Del Mar how to code with a bit of a Robin Hood model. And so the point of showing this whole diagram is how interconnected this ecosystem is between learning how to code, learning how to create, valuing the different types of seeds, et cetera. And so again, this is my last 11 years in one slide, 11 business years in one slide. But I think this type of interconnection can be replicated across the rest of St. Louis. So just to recap, teaching kids to code, teaching everyone how to build great products, importing entrepreneurs, managing a large intern program where people can intern in St. Louis at startups, and then valuing different types of seeds. That's my short recipe for what we can do to improve the entrepreneurial ecosystem, fertilize the St. Louis ground, and end up with a nice harvest. Thank you.
David, thank you.
Welcome.
That really sets the stage nicely, and I particularly enjoyed the slide where you showed you wrapped up your last 11 years in one slide. That was terrific. So we're going to get started with the panel discussion and kind of dig a little bit deeper into some of those topics as well. But first, I'd like to introduce our remaining panelists. Next to David is Tom Hillman, referenced in David's remarks already. Tom has been an investor and a catalyst in private business enterprises for many years, having owned more than 50 companies. He's the founder and managing partner of private equity firm FTL Capital Partners, as well as Lewis and Clark Ventures that you heard about. Lewis and Clark, a venture capital firm, and both of those firms based here in St. Louis. Tom was on the board of Answers, among many other companies. To Tom's left is Jeff Peterson. Jeff is co-founder of Yield Lab, a business accelerator company focusing exclusively on agriculture and investing in promising companies each year and helping with mentoring and business development here in St. Louis. He was previously vice president of strategic development at Monsanto and has served on a number of boards, including the Center for Emerging Technologies. And here to my right is Cliff Holcamp, co-founder and a general partner of Cultivation Capital, which he co-founded in 2012 and has since been recognized as the most active venture fund in the Midwest. Cliff is also Professor Holcamp, is Senior Lecturer of Entrepreneurship and the Academic Director for Entrepreneurship at the Olin Business School at Washington University in St. Louis. So welcome, everybody. Tom, I'd like to start with you. As I mentioned, we are going to do a little bit deeper dive into some of the things that David talked about. But perhaps first we can talk about where we are today. Could you help kind of set our baseline and kind of tell where this ecosystem that we're describing is now and how we got here?
Yeah. So when David started, and you look today, 11 years, and you look at our ecosystem as you speak about, it's dramatically different. And dramatically in the respect that there are mentorship programs, there's infrastructure, there's public support, there's a lot of startups, there are accelerators, and there's great research that's done in our community. So with that being said, there really isn't an area and touch point if you want to start up a company that there aren't resources and connections that you can make. And so today, I could mention these, T-Rex, Cortex, Helix, the Danforth Plant Science Center. There's just a plethora of things that weren't here 11 years ago. And so it's an environment that's been acknowledged nationally and internationally as a startup community.
One might even comment on the building that we're in today and the role that the Danforth Plant Science Center has had.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, we keep hearing this term accelerator, Jeff. Maybe you could tell us what is an accelerator and tell us a little more specifically about Yield Lab.
Sure, I'd be happy to. When most companies start out, they're self-funded. But self-funding, again, for most companies, only can go so far. And usually that's not far enough to be able to get in with the VC and get funded there. So like angel groups, like crowdfunding, accelerators fill that gap. But they fill that gap with more than just money. They fill that gap with knowledge, with mentorship, with coaching, and they fill that gap by being able to open doors for these young startup companies that these young startup companies most of the time can't open. Whether it's with big multinational companies or other investors, it gets these companies in front of people that they otherwise may not be able to, with the whole idea of accelerating them from where they are today to be able to get into and get funded by a VC tomorrow. And we usually stick with them even beyond that. In Yield Lab, we've invested in 12 companies, and none of them had any VC funding when we started working with them. And now about 80% of them have been funded by VCs. Some of them have gone through both a Series A and a Series B, all within a couple years of working with us going forward. Yield Lab focuses on, I think, a broad area, but relatively narrow in some sense, ag technology only. But ag technology isn't just plants and animals, but it's supply chain, both to and from the farm. It's sustainability, it's food. So when we say ag technology, we encompass all those areas. And if you look at our portfolio of companies, that's what they fit into.
Excellent. Cliff, we've talked about accelerators. We've talked about a lot of the other organizations that have been developed to pull the entrepreneurs together. And clearly St. Louis has been recognized as successful. 11 years, a lot has occurred. One of the words I know you use a lot is density. Maybe talk a little bit about the importance of density in this ecosystem and why it's so critical to our success.
Sure.
Give some examples if you could, please.
Yeah. So when you talk about the components of an ecosystem, I like to divide it into 3 main buckets. And I think most people are keenly aware of the first 2. Number 1 is talent. A lot of what David was talking about was how to develop or to recruit talent. The second is capital, which is something that obviously we've made a lot of strides in, but you need to fuel that talent with money so that they can build the things that they're building. The third is the one I think people have the most trouble with and can be difficult for policymakers, and that's density. And the idea of density is to get your talent and your capital and to put them together in close proximity together. And the reason you want to do that is because if you don't do that, then you don't end up creating a community. And by definition, a community is a group of people who have shared experiences. And when you have a group of people who have shared experiences, they develop a culture. And when you have a culture, then that attracts new entrants, right? And so density creates the environment for people to have shared experiences because they're in close proximity, which creates the environment to be able to have those people develop a culture, which then become attractants to more people to joining it. David's points about recruiting students to stay here in St. Louis, I can tell you we've made incredible strides in the last 4 years in that regard, and it's entirely because they want to be part of the culture here. They're excited about the innovation culture. They've gotten exposed to it. They got a taste of it, and that's a community that they want to join. So you have to be able to create a community that serves as a lighthouse or a beacon to draw people. The other elements that are very important about density is the idea of recycling talent. So there's a lot of turnover in startups, both in the companies themselves when they don't all make it, and with any company, people come in and out of jobs. When you have a dense ecosystem, you're more likely to recycle that talent. Talent is actually our biggest constraint in growing our entrepreneurial economy. It's actually, even though I'm in the capital business, I'll tell you it's not capital, it's actually talent. So when you group that talent together and they form relationships with other people in the ecosystem, you're more likely when there's job turnover that talent will stay in the ecosystem and work for another startup, rather than going and interviewing and getting a job at a corporation or, heaven forbid, moving and working for a corporation in another town. So density is very important for the recycling of talent. And third, density is really important for the prospects of the business themselves. So if you think about a corporation launching a new product, they're going to sit in their big boardroom, drinking their scotch and smoking big cigars, and they're going to be saying to themselves, how do we leverage the assets of our business to be able to launch this product? How can we leverage our distribution networks? How can we leverage our manufacturing expertise? How can we leverage our marketing expertise? Startups don't approach growth of their businesses the same way. They have no resources. They have no assets, right? And so as an entrepreneur, you're operating in an environment with a lack or a constraint of resources. So your only resources are your relationships, right? Your relationships or your network is how you secure resources. You secure resources through networking to them, a relationship. That's why something like Yield Lab is so important. They basically have a whole network built in for you that you can jump into. But being in a dense environment, to be in a T-Rex or being at a Cortex or being at Bridge Park gets you plugged in to a network that's bigger than yourself. Entrepreneurs who are working in their parents' basement or in their house in Chesterfield, they starve themselves for resources because they're denying themselves the ability to plug into a greater network and then getting connected to assets and resources. So density is that critical component that I think a lot, from a civic perspective, is hard to miss. And sometimes that goes afoul of political priorities, which is to spread resources out evenly. But you actually don't want to spread resources evenly across a state or across a region. You actually want to condense those into small hubs, into small dense areas, so that you can create this sense of density within your ecosystem. And that's what we're doing with the startup, with the tech entrepreneur ecosystem downtown, with what's happening in Cortex, based with life sciences, but is expanded into other areas, and what we're trying to do here around the Danforth Center and Ag Tech and Plant Sciences.
Excellent. Thank you. David, I love the story about the computer that was pulled from the scrap pile and brought home to you. Clearly, you had a chance at an early age to exercise your interest in technology. You taught yourself how to code, and that gave you one of the key ingredients for success. But I know there's more to it. One of the things you talked about a little bit was the desire to create tangible products, and maybe talk a little bit about that mindset, the creative mindset. And do you think that's something that can be taught in schools?
Yeah, so I did well in school, and I'm a fan of school, but not anti-school. However, if you think about the academic model is we're going to give you a set of information, and then we're going to give you a test to prove whether or not you absorbed this information, and then we're going to move you on to another subject. In the real world, in the academic world, it's like we're going to give you all of the questions, you have to go fill in the answers. In the real world, even identifying the questions is sometimes a much, much bigger exercise than trying to fill in the answers. And so I think if you want to produce more entrepreneurs if you think that's important for the city, we need to do things for more experiential learning, where kids can try things and fail, and that's okay. And not every project they do has to get a millennial gold star, right? I'll speak for my own people on that one. But yeah, I think we need to foster an environment where kids are creating stuff. Like, one of the things I love, even my oldest daughter's in preschool, is when she brings something home that she made. And it may look only slightly better than my hand-drawn PowerPoint in terms of artistic quality. But the ability to see kids go from an idea and turn it into something and then to iterate on it, I think we have to just encourage that rather than turn our kids into Scantron filler outers.
That's helpful. Maybe tie that back to the density comment, and you get a community of people who are doing it. Maybe to kind of describe the process. Once you get beyond the school age, you get into you're in college, you're out of college, you're developing an idea. How does that process work, and how does the community assist in that way? Maybe a little case study.
Yeah, so I think the best entrepreneurs are usually the entrepreneurs who aren't taking their first major league swing, and that's the first time they've picked up a bat, right? So, I had 6 or 7 different ventures before we founded Announce Media, and they all, kind of sputtered along, but we learned something from each one. We learned how to develop software when we did our web design business, and then we used that to do online marketing in the next business, and we used that to develop out some technical systems for our lead business, and then we used that to develop our comparison shopping engine, which we used that to develop out the Q&A stuff. And so I like entrepreneurs who have gone through and started even a very, very small business and had even just a sliver of success, because it's a good predictor that if they can continue to go at it and they pick the right business model and they pick the right team and partners, that they're more likely to do well going out later. The first-time entrepreneur who's trying to raise millions of dollars, who doesn't have any customers and doesn't have any product, I think those folks end up having a much higher fail rate.
Excellent, excellent. Jeff, we've talked about your experience at an accelerator, but you've also got some experience with one of the larger companies in town. What role do particularly large research-oriented companies play in this process? And as the second part, do those companies view these startups as a threat?
Great question. So virtually, or at least most large companies that I've worked for, I've worked for probably a half a dozen, and companies that large companies that I've known, all have a philanthropic component to what they do. So they always want to give back to the community, and they do that with money. But they do it besides money is with talent. And David, I heard you talk about it. As people kind of shuffle through these big companies in and out, that's a huge talent pool for the entrepreneurial area. So that's always positive. And lastly, they actually connect to a lot of these startup companies because they're doing things that they're interested in. And so they'll collaborate with them. They'll be some of their first customers. They'll be the validators of those businesses. And then the last piece that these big companies do, and your last question is, are they a threat? I had heard the Bear CEO speak a few months ago out in San Francisco, and he got that very question. And he said, hey, as big as we are, as much money as we spend looking for new ideas and on R&D, we can't do it all. And we're not always the smartest people out there. So our philosophy, and I think it's the philosophy of at least the most progressive of the large companies, is go out there and actually not only look for these ideas outside yourself, but actually encourage those ideas to take place. So I like what you had said about Boeing, taking patents and said, run with them. I think those are the best ways for these big companies to actually grow is by sharing, and the more progressive ones do that.
Thanks. Tom, we talk a lot, and in fact, we talk a lot about life sciences in this community. In fact, we're sitting in the Danforth Plant Science Center. Certainly, we're very proud of what this community has built, thanks to the incredible leadership of people like Dr. Danforth, who really deserves a round of applause, I think. how about on the tech side? Is the model that the life sciences community has used applicable in technology? Where are the differences, and how far along are we with tech companies?
So I think that's a good question. And, you know, earlier you asked the question, where are we today? Mm-hmm. And oftentimes I think, how did we get to where we are? And then what is that foundational piece that will catapult us with giving us rise and impact? And I'm going to start by saying it's visionary leadership. And thank you for acknowledging, you know, Bill Danforth, because when I look back at some of the things that he's been involved with, Cortex, when it was an idea, this whole ag tech corridor that is just beginning, that's the visionary leadership that we need. But as it applies to technology, I think we have visionary leadership there that we're going to see the fruits of. And part of what I say is that great people like Dr. Danforth have dug the wells, and we're in a reservoir today. But I see more wells being dug. When I look at Jim McKelvey, who I know was your speaker last year, and see what he's done to launch code. When I see the computer science out of Washington University, when I see some of the startups down at T-Rex in the technology, and what Gabe Lozano's done in terms of the hackathons. I mean, this is creativity at its best with solving problems. So the short answer is that it's visionary leaders that are even here today, and people who are planting seeds who may not ever see the shade from those seeds that they've planted, but they've dug great reservoirs that we could drink from for a long time.
Are we seeing the benefits of that already? Did Answers and as Varsity Tutors and some of the companies we've talked about, are they benefiting from this ecosystem in tangible ways?
Very much. So I think what David showed on his chart is that you have a monetization, and a lot of people in the company benefit from that. And then they're off starting new ideas, and they have the talent, they have the training, they have the experience, and now they have a little more capital and credibility. So you're seeing companies sprout, and you're seeing more development that way. And that's what's happened a lot in other areas, particularly Silicon Valley. And so people are happy to recycle and do it right in our own backyard.
Cliff, we talked about your professorship and your focus on students at the college level and beyond. What about the K through 12 level? David talked about the benefits of teaching computer science in addition to earth science. What are your views on that?
He's singing my song. So I'm quite passionate about this, and I've been a real irritant at my daughter's school on this topic, so you might have already heard about that. There's a great quote from Mark Andreessen where he says
Mark
this,
being?
Oh, he's a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz. And his quote is, "Software is eating the world." And what he means by that is that what software does is automate processes, right? And there is not a process that is not subject to being automated by software. So think about all the things in your life. Think about all the things that you do as part of your job. Think about different kinds of jobs and different kinds of careers. Any part of those jobs that involve a process will be automated. We're already seeing things getting automated that we never thought would. We're seeing that stockbrokers have been automated. That profession long term is going to change dramatically, and the number is going to be reduced dramatically. We're seeing parts of medicine get automated, which changes the roles of doctors. We're seeing high-end professions get automated, as well as, of course, as the lower-end, process-oriented ones that we all think of on the plant floor or the clerks. I mean, there used to be, you look at downtown of those big, huge buildings, they were full of hundreds of clerks. I don't even know what a clerk is anymore. But clerks were people who pushed paper, and that whole job of being a clerk is gone, right, in a big corporate environment. So the fact is that over time, anything that's a process will get replaced by software. Most jobs are people who manage processes, right? And so when we're educating the future of our city, we need to be thinking to ourselves, do we want our children to grow up to be the people who are getting automated, or do we want to train them to be the automators? It's incredibly important that we teach our kids to be automators. The way you do that is to teach them computer science, even at a basic level, so that they can be on the automator side. I'm also going to add, this isn't just for the elite private schools. This is probably more important, as David illustrates with geography, the north of Del Mar environment, right? The inner city schools, the middle income schools. Those software coding jobs are those middle class manufacturing jobs of the future. There's a misperception that computer scientists are all geniuses like David. They are, throw a little compliment out there. The truth is, we need assembly line coders just as much as we need visionary leaders as coders. We need people who are going to just get out there and pump code. Those are those high-paid union factory jobs of the future. But we're not training our children to be able to take them. Every child who graduates from our public schools should know enough programming that they could always go get a job, that they can get a job as a programmer, as a middle-of-the-line programmer at a school. And if we're not, and I'll tell you, other countries are doing that. So if we're not going to teach our kids to do that, we're going to be outsourcing that to other countries, and our kids are going to be sitting around on welfare. So the jobs, the manufacturing jobs are going away. They're being replaced by coding jobs. It is critically important, and we're totally ignoring it. So I'm incredibly passionate about K through 12 coding. A lot of these kids may not think that they're going to be a coder someday. I can't tell you how many of my high school friends who had no interest in computers when they're in high school are now computer programmers in their 40s because they were able to adapt and they were able to figure it out on the fly. That's a hard thing to do. It's a lot easier if it's something you just grew up with and are comfortable with. One more analogy I use, in most schools we don't teach our kids computer science, we teach our kids computers. And that would be like in math if we taught our kids calculators instead of teaching our kids math. We need to stop teaching our kid calculators, and we need to start teaching them math when it comes to computer programming.
Excellent, excellent. David, the image, by the way, I loved your artwork. This is excellent.
Thank you.
The image of the truckload of seeds coming in every fall and then leaving every spring brings up my next topic.
Sure.
Thankfully, you own a nice home in St. Louis. I think you've put down some great roots here. You've got 3 already and 1 in the oven. What do we do to keep people like you hungry once you've experienced an event? Maybe that's just innate. You have that hunger. What do we do to keep people like you in this city and contributing to this ecosystem?
I think we have to just keep moving forward as a city. I agree with what Cliff said about density, about creating these pockets of entrepreneurial activity. I want St. Louis to be right up there at the top of entrepreneurial cities. When you look at the lists of, people throw out San Francisco, but then they'll throw out a Boston or an Austin or maybe a Denver. We should be right up there. We have I think we're in the top 5 on passive wealth cities per capita in the United States. We've got great universities. We just need to put our resources together and continue to build out this entrepreneurial ecosystem. I think a city where there are vibrant businesses, and both for-profit and nonprofits being started, that's a place where I want to live as a person. I could live anywhere. I could live anywhere around the globe. But as we see that happen, I think you'll attract and retain folks who are on the other side of the entrepreneurial curve.
What's missing now? We've talked a lot today about the many great things that are going on in this city. The density, the startup activity has grown. If you read the press today, St. Louis is really one of the fastest growing, very, very top, fast growing entrepreneurial cities in the United States. And we've been given a lot of accolades. There are a lot of other cities that are pouring resources to try and do this, and it's just not working. So clearly we've got some of the intangibles going for us. But what do we need to do to get to the next level?
So I think there are a lot of different things that we can do. I think one thing from an earlier comment that I wanted to touch on is I think we've a lot of times presented a very false choice to our entrepreneurs where we said you either need to self-fund your business venture or you need to venture or angel fund your business venture. The best businesses that I see are the ones that aren't primarily self-funded and aren't primarily venture funded. They're the ones that are customer funded. Like we wouldn't have gotten off the ground at Announced Media and Answers if we didn't start on day one with a customer. If I do another startup, which as long as my wife doesn't tell me I can't work 80 hours a week anymore, I probably will at some point. I would start, if I was going to start another business again, I would start a customer-funded business from day one. I think.
What does that look like?
I think what that looks like is identifying a problem first to go solve, rather than starting just with the technology and trying to find a place to stick it into. And so, obviously, there are categories like in the research world, in the plant science world, where the research takes years to develop, and the medical world is similar. So I don't think this is applicable to every category. But in general, if I was going to give advice to an entrepreneur, I would say, look, if you can go start with a customer, your business might not be the next Google or Facebook, but your likelihood of getting at least a single or a double or turning this into something goes up substantially than if you're sitting in to Cliff's point, if you're sitting in your room trying to build something that nobody's ever going to use. So really focusing on that, really putting an emphasis on, hey, you want to be an entrepreneur? Like, who's your customer from day one?
Tom, I'd put that same question to you with a twist. What's missing being the question, what do we need to kind of go to the next level? And then the twist is, we've got a great audience of folks here, many of whom are really eager to get involved and would love to hear how they can get involved, what they can do, how they can be a part of this exciting path that we're on. I'd love to hear from you on that.
Sure. So I think St. Louis, first off, I'm from the East Coast. I came here to attend Washington University and chose to stay here and raise a family, and I'm really proud of that. Like David, we could live anywhere in the world, but we choose St. Louis. And one of the reasons is that I think we are an extraordinarily generous community. I feel that even though there's competition in business, that we're collaborative, that we share with one another our ideas, we want to introduce, we want to really live with these Midwest values that's kind. And so when I look at what's missing and what we could be doing, I believe that there's a lot of talent that's here, and I think we need to recruit more talent. I think one of the voids is you have other communities with very large companies with C-suite talent, and we don't have enough of that here. And I think it will evolve, and there'll be a rising tide. So I believe in paying forward, and it's time, talent, and treasure. And so the mentorship program, I believe, is every bit as important as the internship program, because it's the matching of bringing people with experience and know-how with those that have the ambition. I mean, who wouldn't back a young man like this, starting with 3 people that grew to 750 people and stayed in the position of CEO? I mean, there are extraordinary people in this community, and it's a matter of identifying who those people are and believing in them and providing those opportunities. And that's what we can do, is identify the future champions, because they're the leaders for the future. And if we don't invest in them, then our future is defined very differently.
Excellent. Jeff, anything on that subject? What do we need to do to go to the next level?
Yeah. So a couple things. So I think it's already been mentioned, money, resources attract people to a particular area. If they think that they come here, there's the resources that they need to be successful, the money to be successful, but it doesn't keep them here. And so the thing that I found in talking to a lot of people, the thing that keeps you in a place, or if you, a lot of the companies get bought and get moved to someplace else, what'll keep people coming back is relationships. Strong relationships that are business, that are personal, that are family, and to encourage those things, and in a community that's involved. So that goes beyond the business. A lot like what David said on the coding in the high schools and before. those relationships to want to do more than just grow a business will keep people here and keep pulling them back if they happen to go because of an exit.
And how does the community foster that? I mean, obviously, we all talk in this town about where we went to high school, so we've got those relationships, but you're talking about something far beyond that.
Yeah, I'm talking about for people that come here who didn't go to high school like myself. I'm like you, I grew up on the East Coast. But if I were ever having to leave here for some reason, I'd come back to St. Louis. I've lived all over. I lived in Europe, I lived in Asia, I lived in a number of places in the United States. But my favorite place is here in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And it became my favorite place because the relationships. There is no place where you can have access to the diversity of people up and down the business chain and broadly across as there is in St. Louis. And so anything we can do to foster those relationships, I think, would really hold people here to repeat, particularly if they're successful people, to repeat what they've done. Whether it's executives in large companies or very successful startup entrepreneurs, to have them stay here and to keep that talent here and to give back going forward.
Excellent. Cliff, I'm going to give you the last word.
Uh-oh.
What do you think? How are we doing? And do you feel like this is still climbing? Have we reached a plateau? We've talked about some great things today. Or what are we still moving in the right direction?
We're definitely still climbing. We definitely have a long way to go. We're not even close to finished. Some interesting stats referencing some of the other points made. Before 2012, which is when I consider that the entrepreneurial tech ecosystem was really born here with T-Rex, in my Hatchery course, which is an entrepreneurship class, 51% of the students who started their businesses started them in St. Louis. After 2012, so since sort of the birth of the ecosystem, 91% of my students started their companies in St. Louis. And I've seen an absolute, beyond noticeable shift that before 2012, those who weren't founders but wanted to work for startups, it was all about how can I get connected to Silicon Valley. Some of them wanted to go to Chicago, some wanted to go to New York, might have depended where they're from, some wanted to get home, but it was always about us building bridges to them going somewhere else, or it was a more exciting city, a brighter light that was attracting them. Since 2012, they're still interested in Silicon Valley, they're still interested in Chicago, New York, but St. Louis is also on the list. So they like what they see here. And to David's point about internships, the key to that difference is that in the entrepreneurship program at WashU, we are very purposeful and take great action to get them off campus, out of the WashU bubble and engaged in the community. And we do that actually through exactly the way he mentioned, through experiential learning. The entrepreneurship majors are the only ones in the business school that require experiential learning as a requirement for graduation. So every student gets off campus working with startups in the St. Louis area and also with internships. I counsel all the students that nowadays, if you're not working a part-time internship in addition to school, you're falling behind. That's kind of a bare necessity for being a top achiever, a high achiever, which all these students want to be. So what we're seeing is when we show others what we have, they come. I think maybe might be an outlier, but a story I really liked. I met this young lady last summer at an event, and she was in her mid to late 20s. She was a computer programmer, and she was moving here from Austin. And she came to St. Louis without a job, and she was at this thing to network to look for a job. She has no family here. She didn't know anybody here. And I asked her, why in the world would you leave Austin, Texas, which is this great city with this great nightlife and the great music scene and a great technology ecosystem? Why would you leave Austin to come to St. Louis without any prospects? Kind of thinking, what's wrong with you? And her response was, Austin is old. She said that it's gotten, the startup ecosystem there is really corporate. She's like, it's plateaued. And she's like, I want to be in a city that's a startup too. She's like, I want to be part of a community where things are growing, things are happening, and I can be part of something bigger. And so to think that this incredibly talented, beautiful young woman left Austin, which is, I think, an aspirational city in so many ways, to come here because she wanted to be part of what's happening Well, that's just one data point. It's a phenomenal data point, and I think we just need to continue doing what we're doing and attracting people like that to St. Louis.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to tell you, I hope everybody has learned something today. It's a very exciting time in our community, in the technology, in the life sciences world, and really just any aspect of the startup community. And there are a lot of opportunities for those who aren't as familiar to learn more. We've talked about places like T-Rex and Cortex, certainly the Danforth Plant Science Center, Helix, and others. Many of these places host events for the general public to come and mingle and interact with entrepreneurs. And I would encourage everyone in this room and anyone that you think who's not here who would be interested to take advantage of that. So thank you all very much. Thanks to our incredible panel.
If we could hold you for just a few minutes, I'd like to, first of all, thank this incredible group of people, starting with David. Thank you again for spending a few days with us out here at the Danforth Plant Science Center. Tom, Jeff, Cliff, and Jack, thank you so much for everything that you do for the center, and especially for what you've done this morning. We succeed in large part because of the community that we interact with here in St. Louis. So thank you so much. Give them another round of applause. Also want to thank you, the audience, for coming. You have other things you could be doing starting at 7:30 in the morning, but you chose to come here. We appreciate that. I especially want to thank a very special group of students from the Parkway Spark Incubator. If you're from the Parkway Spark Incubator, raise your hand really high. This is a group. This is a group I just met this morning. It's 12, 14 of you. These are all high school students who are all starting their own businesses, who have built a little ecosystem in their peer group. They're connecting with the ecosystem that you've heard about this morning. And they're the next generation of leaders. It's terrific, and I really enjoyed talking with you this morning. One last thing. In listening this morning, it's almost a little too easy when you have a name like Seeds of Change to use plant analogies. It's almost too easy. I don't want to diminish what David did this morning. It was very creative. But there are so many opportunities in the world of plant science to make some parallels to what we're doing here in St. Louis, or what we're aspiring to do. And I just want to leave you with this thought. As you're leaving, you're going to drive by various parts of what we're doing in the front yard to reestablish a Missouri tallgrass prairie. Many of you know what a Missouri tallgrass prairie is. It's what used to be here 150 years ago before all the trees came in when we populated the prairie. It's dominated by tall grasses here, species like big blue stem. It has dozens and dozens of other species that I don't know the species name, so I can't even tell you what they are. But we've planted them out here. It's going to take 3-4 years for that prairie to come in. And a guy that's advising us on this is a guy named Scott Woodbury from Shaw Nature Reserve. He runs the Whitmire Wildflower Preserve. Great guy. And the first time we walked out here after we seeded the prairie, after the construction was done, we're walking through and I'm looking at all the plants coming up. And I say, this is fantastic. It's succeeding. And he's looking at me and said, what are you talking about? The stuff that you're seeing right here is just the cover crop. That's just the cover grasses and some attractive wildflowers that we threw in so people driving by wouldn't be offended by a bare, weedy lot. I say, okay. I say, well, let's look at the prairie species. And he said, well, you can't see them yet. I say, okay, that's a disappointment. Came back a couple months later, and we're out there walking through, and I said, Scott, show me the prairie species. And he says, well, okay, let's go search. And we had to peel back the cover crop, the ryegrass and some of the other things that we planted, so that you wouldn't be offended by bare, weedy space. And he would say, there's one. And then we'd pull it, and he said, there's some more, there's some more. And it's all over out there. You just can't see it. So what are they doing right now? What the prairie species like big bluestem and little bluestem and all the things that are going to dominate that ecosystem out there, they are putting roots down deep. What distinguishes what's going to survive and dominate in that reconstructed prairie are the things that deep root and that are patient and that convert what used to be, just a few months ago, bare, lousy dirt. Most of the topsoil was removed. Bare, ugly dirt that most cultivated plants wouldn't be able to grow in. What those deep-rooted prairie species are doing is they're converting the soil. And they're providing, very patiently, an ecosystem where the other prairie species are going to come in. Some of those other prairie species are going to look very different than the dominant big bluestem, the ones that are going to be visible. But they're going to be an essential part of the prairie. It's going to be diverse. There'll be dozens and dozens of species out there, and they are going to be interdependent on one another. Even though you might see the big flashy ones in 3 years, there's going to be dozens of others that you're going to have to look hard to see, but are essential contributors to the ecosystem. What we're doing at T-Rex, what we're doing at Cortex, and what we're doing out here in this corridor, and what's happening, frankly, at a lot of other places that don't get the press that those 3 places are getting here in this region, is we're setting roots down, and with a little patience, a little work, it's going to bloom. It's going to dominate our ecosystem for decades to come, and we're going to be very, very proud of it. Thank you for contributing to that ecosystem. Thank you for coming.